Good evening and welcome to our first ever virtual BMW Art Talk. My name is Uma Jacob and I lead programming, collector engagement and outreach at the India Art Fair. Today, we're extremely excited to have the wonderful opportunity to spotlight the multidisciplinary, uber-talented artist, Mehhta Bhupal, as the first ever Indian artist to be the focus of this BMW Art Talk. Welcome, Dia. Lovely to have you with us today.
Thank you, Uma. Looking forward to it.
Great. Just to give you all a brief introduction, Dia was born in Mumbai and currently lives and works in Hyderabad, India. Her work focuses on redefining everyday images as commonly interpreted by society. Trained at Parsons in New York and Central St. Martin's in London, the artist creates intricate sets of spaces like movie theaters, bookshops, and grocery stores with an aim to capture private moments in public spaces. Dia creates fine art photography, primarily working with the constructed image. She has exhibited widely through India and internationally as part of major exhibitions such as at the Lyon Biennale, the Kochi Muziris Biennale, the Pizzuti Collection, and the Yinchuan Biennale. And Dia is represented by Gallery Ski based in Bangalore. Today, she will tell us what an image means to us, how the city she lived in influenced her art, and the role of an artist in imagining a sustainable future. Before we begin, just a few house rules to note before we proceed. As this is a live session, we recommend that you use your headphones as far as possible to be able to hear the dialogue most clearly. And please feel free to drop in your questions. At the bottom, there's a question box at the bottom of your screen. We should have a couple of minutes at the end to pose a few of your questions to Dia after the session today. So Dia, let's begin today. Let's start from the very beginning. Take us back, please, to your earliest memory of wanting to be an artist, growing up in a creatively inclined household with your father being an avid photographer and your mother a jewelry designer. Was the need to express yourself through art always there? And how did you first start expressing yourself creatively?
I'd firstly like to thank you for the generous introduction. I personally believe that we are all creative in our day-to-day, whether it's the way we speak, the way we eat, or just simply the way we interact with the world around us. I don't necessarily have a moment which sparked my creativity, but I do have a few moments that probably led me where I am today. My mom's a jewelry designer, so growing up, she was always sketching on sheets of paper and she always sharpened the most beautiful pencils. And I was always very fascinated with it. And it was really interesting to see the way she would sketch out of her imagination. And I always got to steal a few to do my homework. So that was always really fun. As for spending time and learning from my dad, I have to say that he always had a camera on him, especially when we traveled and on family holidays. And that's really when I began playing with the camera and really allowing to explore the journey of what the camera and using the technology. Of course, back then there was no digital photography and everything was manual. Sorry, could we go to the previous image, please? So this image is an image I took with my dad's camera probably when I was 15. We were traveling and I got to use his camera when we were on safari. This was, of course, with a Canon. It was a manual camera and it was really exciting to have it developed, to shoot it on film and to wait to come back and really see what we had captured.
Lovely. I think that photograph really says a lot. And even looking at it so many years later, it really has, it's still really impactful, I would say.
Thank you.
We can then move on to I would say, your education. So let's talk a little bit about this. You went on to study in Parsons in New York and Central St. Martin's in London, both iconic art schools on both sides of the pond. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like, being an art student in the heart of these two meccas of artistic influence and history? What courses did you take on, and which of these did you find particularly intriguing? What about your, faculty, friends, and peers, for instance?
So I went to do my foundation studies at Central St. Martin's in London. And that's really 1 year where I got to dabble in various areas, whether it was life drawing, painting, studio time, or whether it was a little bit of fashion, a bit of photography. And it was really in that year where I discovered my innate passion for making images and for photography, and the fascination I had with being able to frame something around me and responding to the world around me. It was that year that I took the decision to apply to the Parsons School of Design in New York, because they had a very strong photography department. And I moved to New York a year later. I have to say, New York was very magical. The peer group and the students I got to study with were extremely interesting. They were from all over the world. And the teaching at Parsons was slightly different because we had to work a lot in groups. We spent a lot of time doing projects together, because it was that time that I really learned how to light. We got to use cameras from the archives of the Parsons Museum, and we got to rent a 4x5 camera, take it on the streets of New York and photograph it. And it was a really interesting time to see what was going on. And documented. At that point, I was primarily working on film, because it was the beginning of the digital era in around 2003. I think there was an image earlier of a girl, so that was in my senior year, and it was the first year I used a digital camera. And that was a Nikon, a 4.1 megapixel Nikon, the D2H. And it was our final assignment for our studio class, so where we got to light everything, we got to work with live models. And the fashion department in Parsons at that time had styled the shoot. So it was a really collaborative project. And it was very interesting to learn at that period when I look back today, merely because it was highly collaborative. And as a student, it's really interesting to learn from your peers and from different points of view. That was also a time where I began, obviously, interacting with the city to a large extent. I got to spend a lot of time going to museums, going to parks, and I went to a few flea markets as well. And that's where I began discovering really old cameras from the late 1800s. And I began a small collection, because I would always find a few and then spend the weekend using them to make photographs. It was also a time in New York where photography was very big, and there was a wide variety of films available. There was a wide variety of studios and dark rooms, which is where I spent a lot of time. And I think it was really that engagement that ingrained my passion to photography even further, to kind of see everything come together with a community that was like-minded. I particularly remember one class I took in Photoshop, and it was CS8, which was still the 8th version of Photoshop, whereas today we're on 22.4, which is much further ahead. And that was one of the first times that you could color pick and get the saturation of the CMYK per image. And I had a really interesting duo of teachers called Anthony Aziz and Sammy Kusher. And they used to work primarily on the digital image as fine art, which was not very common in 2003, 2004. And they really used Photoshop to the limit. So they really used to use the tools that the software could show, as opposed to what it was commonly used at that time. And I think being in these various dialogues, it of course teaches you so many different things of the past, of the present, and of the future. And I really think my education gave me a foundation to my technical knowledge and what I'm doing today.
Wonderful. I mean, you can just almost picture what must have been like being a student, in Parsons and working like that and the peer group. And clearly, it left a lot of impressions on you as a young budding artist.
It's very magical.
Lovely to hear. Um, then we move on to post that when you made your return to India. And you had some early forays into the professional world. Can you tell us a bit about what that was like? We'd love to hear about your experiences as being a young photographer working in the print media. What was it like, being back? Did you slip back in, or was it difficult to readjust? And what was working life like when you went back?
So when I graduated, I'd already been away for 7 to 8 years because I went to boarding school before that. And it was really an exciting time to come back in to India and specifically Bombay, because I think it was a point where advertising, fashion photography, magazines, it was almost in 2006. So it was way before Vogue entered India or any large international publications entered India. But there was still a lot of creative work going on. Of course, there was no social media. There was, I think Facebook had just come in, but it really wasn't being used as a medium for advertising the way it's used today. It was primarily used to connect with your friends from all over the globe. So when I moved back, I did a few assignments with various advertising agencies. I did a few assignments with newspapers, magazines, a few projects for some brands. And it was really exciting because it was a very interesting team of people to work with of varied age groups. So the orders always came from an older age group, whereas the team on ground was young. It was full of energy. It was full of ideas. We didn't have Pinterest and we didn't have many tools that we have today to really ideate on a shoot or a concept or to really use the image to tell the message that you're trying to say that's beyond so many words, but simply gets put into one frame. And I really enjoyed being back home because I looked at it very differently. So this is a portrait I took of my mom for Harper's Bazaar, and it was a very strange shoot for me because I shot it with my mom, who of course is my biggest critique and my biggest supporter. And it was really interesting to work with someone I knew so closely, and it was the first time I was working with anybody I knew very, very well. And it was a really interesting shoot, and it's been something that has really given me a lot of gratification to be able to work with her and then have the images published. It almost feels like it's come full circle. This is another image of my mom, which was part of the same shoot. This was actually done for Harper's Bazaar in India.
Great, that's really interesting to see. And, it just to think about that time and to think about you as a young photographer shooting your mom. So you're seeing her through these, layered lenses in a way because of, your relationship to her and then you being her photographer.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And
time when once I came back, I think because I'd been in art school for a few years, we were always told to keep pushing our creative boundaries and to keep pushing our ideas. So even while I was photographing commercially and working with different institutions and magazines, I was also developing a personal practice. And this is when I took those images. This is back in 2007 and 2008 when I shot these series of images. I was really questioning where the image is going and how we are responding to the world around us, because by 2008 there was a little more influx of digital photography. So I kind of went, and this was also a time when all the studios in Bombay were shutting down. They were not as accessible. You couldn't just walk into a studio and take images. So I almost staged this shoot. And essentially in this shoot, it's a very traditional approach to Indian photography, which depicts our history. I always feel that the images we look at, they're always a representation of that particular time. And of course, when photography started in the late 1800s, it was after painting. So all the images we saw were either documenting a war, documenting something very monumental in the world around us. And that's really how we got to see what was going on and be connected to a larger landscape. So these images I kind of staged to look almost timeless, even though they were all shot digitally. And I didn't use a female model. I actually used a mannequin because this was also the time in India where the advertising and the language of the way we were looking at images was really changing. I don't know if anybody remembers, but we always had like sari ads with the pallus flying and everything. The way we looked at women started changing. So this was kind of a reflection and a discourse to my view on how images are changing the way we think.
Yeah, it's only when you point that out, really. I wonder, Gautami, can you zoom in a little bit so we can see that on the previous image, that it's actually a mannequin.
Yeah, I remember I had, so back in the days when you went to all the stores, you always had mannequins standing. So remember I had designed this mannequin and found a mannequin supplier because you couldn't really move the limbs or turn the head around too much. It came in like the torso, the legs, which were joined together, the arms, which you could just tilt about 30 degrees, and the head was always straight. So I designed the mannequin and then got it made based on the image that I wanted to create.
Yeah, we can. It's really fascinating, I think. We can, and at that time you were telling us that you also took to photographing other artists, and along with exploring these different forms of commercial photography. Would you like to tell us about a few artists that you photographed perhaps at that time, and what was it? What was that like? How did you come to photographing artists?
So I was actually approached by a publication, and they were doing a story on contemporary artists in India. I was quite young and I was really excited to work on this project because it was always an area of interest for me, even though I wasn't a painter or I wasn't drawing or I wasn't creating sculptures or anything, but it was always an area of interest. And I got to visit about 9 to 10 artist studios between Bombay and Delhi. And it was a really fun time to really go in as a photographer and really see from a different lens what was going on. We did the shoot in a span of 4 days. So we spent 2 days in Bombay and then 2 days in Delhi. And it was a really interesting time to get to spend hours at an artist studio. It was one of the first times I'd really spent that much time with the artists. And it was really interesting. They were, of course, much senior than I was. And there was so much to learn from that. And from really seeing their practice in their studio versus at a gallery or at a fair or in its final form.
Great, thank you for sharing that with us. I don't think many people know really about that phase of your life. Like most artists, we know about your main practice, but it's so interesting to know about what came before that and what it must have been like, in the beginning before you were known as this wonderful contemporary artist that you are today. So, going on from that, perhaps now we can move a little bit into your process. And your practice is so multi-layered and multidisciplinary, has so many stages of making, illusion, and metaphor, really, from the tactile, almost meditative process of hand rolling and creating these paper tubes to the composition and planning of the life size, really, scale of your detailed sets. The lighting that's then involved, and then everything that's involved to then capture the perfect image, which is really quite a process. Can you tell us just briefly? We know it's such a multi-layered process, but if you can just tell us, how did it germinate in your head? Do you see the final image first, or do you begin with the smallest of bits by looking at colors in a magazine? Tell us.
I have to say it's a little bit of everything, given that there's so many layers to the process and I'm foraging multiple layers at a time. I'm essentially building up based on color, shape, and design. And I have to say that my creative process is very mirrored by a logical one, simply because I have to have two constant conversations and have them moving at all times, from what I'm thinking and what I want to make versus how exactly I'm going to make that. So initially, I started working with paper and I began creating tubes of paper. And then I began building small pieces at a time and almost constructing it up to a larger set. I usually start with what I want to make and what my final image would like to look like. I practice a lot of yoga and I've done a lot of Kriya and visualization. And I think that kind of helps and supports my studio practice a lot, because I'm able to envision exactly what I want to create. And then I begin to work backwards as to how I'm going to get to that. One of the things that strongly determines what I can make is the amount of color I find in a magazine. And over the last few years, and also before I actually started working with it, I almost, what colors are available, because of course in print media, certain colors are printed a lot more than others. For instance, 90% of the time you'll find a white page with black text on it. You'll sometimes find black text with a black page with white text on it. There's of course a lot of red and there's a lot of blue. And a lot of the advertisements are either in gray or black. So I kind of work based on what I know I can find, because a lot of times in the last few years, not being able to find a certain color has stalled my process a lot, which is why I also work on two sets at a time simultaneously.
That's interesting to note. Yeah, I guess because you're slowly putting these together and it's all coming to you. And just to note, I guess after so many years, it's you know more than anybody the compositions and the colors, and I guess even trends, right, over the years of magazines, and kind of what's popular, and what colors are kind of trending and
I don't think so much it's about color trends. I think it's just a rudimentary system of color itself, because I really have to get down to the basics when I begin to create objects in my studio.
Right.
Yeah.
Understood. And just going back to then, your absolute first step, like the raw material of the paper. Can you tell us a little bit about where you source this paper from in the first place, and then where do you store all of it? You work so intricately with colors and shapes, like you were mentioning. So I guess there's a process of organizing and sorting and composing this.
So I source the paper from friends and communities around me. Everyone who's cleaning their magazines or, doing a spring clean, especially now in the last 2 weeks before Diwali, I've been very lucky and I've got a whole bunch of magazines that have come in. So I source the paper from around me. I write to a few institutions and larger organizations, and I ask them if they are getting rid of their old magazines to send it over to my studio. And I've been lucky enough to always have an influx of magazines coming in. Essentially, I store all the magazines in my studio. They're just piled up. And yeah, that's really where it is.
All right. I guess we could see in the previous slides also just stacks and stacks of these magazines.
Yeah, and then once I start identifying the colors and making paper tubes, I'm a bit hyper organized with that, because there are multiple factors that I use to kind of separate everything from one another. So I really believe that the design is in the details. When I start working with the colors I find, and I have 2 or 3 techniques of tubes that I make, and then they get separated based on how long or how large the amount of color is on the paper of the magazine.
Mm-hmm.
So I start separating it based on what I'm making, what I'm looking for. So whichever set I'm working on at that point, that's really what I look towards. Of course, sometimes I find a lot of white, so I always keep that on the side, because I end up using a lot of white in my sets simply because it's largely available.
Right. And so then moving on to the sets, these are, such fantastical creations, really shrouded under the guise of everyday public spaces, like we can see in the slideshow. A setting of a gym or a public restroom. They're waiting rooms in the real world that you transcend right out of the ordinary, but still adhering to the visual realism of the space itself. Uh, can you tell us a little bit about why you choose the subject of your sets?
I have to say that ultimately it's the paradox of the photograph where reality is both extended and replaced. Essentially, I have began creating sets, particularly with the spaces that I visited the most often. Whether it's a doctor's waiting room or whether it's the set of the gym you see right now, I feel that there's a lot of spaces in India that have been commercialized in the last 10 to 12 years, where everywhere you go, there's a sense of familiarity. In any city you go to, with like movie theaters sprouting everywhere, tons of gyms opening up, a lot of doctors' clinics that have become very glossy, and they were very different to what they were before. Whereas about 15 years ago, every doctor had an individual practice, and today there's much larger hospitals. The infrastructure's essentially grown so much that the spaces around us have grown with that as well. And there was a sense of familiarity from one to the other. Even if I went to a doctor in Mumbai versus going to a doctor in Hyderabad, the anxiety and the hidden moments of sitting in the waiting room are still the same, even though the spaces are so different, but yet familiar. And I found these moments really interesting because, as we all know, our lives have become fast-paced, and it's not that we do the same thing over and over again. We feel that we're going to different spaces that feel familiar, but it's really the small moments that make it really different. For example, the image here of the doctor's waiting room. We've all been to the doctor, and I know, at least for me, when I go to the doctor, I'm always a little anxious because, of course, I've gone for a reason or for a checkup or for some intervention. And I'm always very anxious to know how extreme the situation might be or may not be. But if there's also a person sitting next to you, and we're not really bothered of what's around us, so we're so within ourselves. And normally a doctor's waiting room or a gym is quite crowded and brimming with bodies, but we never really look at it as just a space. And that, to me, is interesting because they're so familiar, but yet they're so far away.
Yeah, that really makes you think, doesn't it? It's exactly like you said. We all occupy these spaces all the time, but you don't really think of the space in itself. It's more about what's happening.
Spaces we frequent often. We spend a lot of time in them collectively. And I don't know, I feel like we don't really stop and wonder where we are, what we're doing. We're just on the go, finishing one thing after the other. I don't think we have an image of the supermarket on my slideshow, but for example, a supermarket, like there's so many new supermarkets that have sprouted out with commercialization growing so much right now. And back in the day, we used to go to the Kirana Dukan. And today we go to the supermarket with a list of things we need, and then we end up buying a few extra things because we've been subconsciously affected by the marketing or the way it's been placed or what we've seen on an advertisement. And we all come out with our own trolleys. But even though we're all in the same space, each individual's experience is very different to the next person. I don't think 2 shopping trolleys from a supermarket will ever have the same items in it. And I find it an interesting space where you're with yourself. You're always looking for what you need. Yeah, I find these spaces extremely fascinating, where even though you are in public, you're still in a very private moment.
Right. And then what about the final image as we're looking at it? Does photographing the sets itself then feel like the culmination of months and months of planning, creating, and most importantly, labor? And how do you, can you tell us about that final place in your, in the process when you're there and the set is ready, and then it's about lighting it and then working to get that perfect image?
I wouldn't necessarily call it a perfect image. I would say it's a constructed image based on my experiences and my memory. I have to say that I spent around 18 months to make one work.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of bittersweet to photograph it. There are moments where I'm really excited because it's also a culmination of 18 months of thinking and planning and designing and making. But it's also really sad because I'm like, oh, now this is done. Now I have to start the next one. But I have to say that the lighting plays an immense role in the way I design the space itself. Because as you know, the sets, everything is made out of paper tubes. And magazine paper is very glossy. So the way the light reflects off the paper itself when it's in tubes, it reads as an image very differently. I don't know how closely you've looked at the sets, but there are all these patterns forming when I design the smaller pieces. So when you look at the image, you see these patterns forming, and that's how your eye kind of travels through the image because because they're all tubes, it kind of directs your vision in a certain way. So in that sense, there's a lot of design and a lot of technicalities. And the lighting for me is really important because I feel these public spaces have a very specific white flat light. And as you know, like when you see something, it's of course the conditions you see in it that you really respond to. So for the lighting, for example, I also built an airplane. So when I built an airplane and I designed the windows that were next to the seats, there was seats, and in between the seats are the windows, like there are on an airplane. I used the windows to truly leak light into the image itself, so I could get an even tone of lighting because the set was very deep, and there was no way for me to put the light in from just the front of the set. So even while constructing, I'm always thinking about how I'm going to light it and how the final image is going to read. Because at the end of the day, I do construct to photograph. So I really look at how we look at images today and how we respond to images today. And of course, we see thousands of images a day, but not a lot of them leave an impression. And not a lot of them stick by you simply because you're constantly bombarded by them. So I really question as to trying to create a space that reflects part of your reality.
Understood. And it just, it makes you think, especially when you made the point about how the tubes are then arranged in these patterns. And yes, of course they are. And I think they also add to the dimensionality of the pieces. It draws your eye, like you said, and it just adds that extra.
So essentially, even in the work earlier, which we saw of the waiting room, I've done these floor tiles, which you see everywhere, right? Like there's always tiles there, either 6x6 for the walls or 12x12 for the floor. The ceiling is usually 15x15, and they almost form a pattern. But that the pattern is also formed from the design of the way I lay the tubes in conjunction with the way the space is lit.
Right.
For example, in this work, I don't know if you can see there's lights on the ceiling and they appear to be switched on almost. That's because I've intentionally used white paper for magazines that do not have text on them. So when the space is lit, the reflection will be different because there's no elements of black text on it. So you feel that the lights are lighting the space when you look at it as an image.
That's fascinating because you see the details, but then think about the planning that goes into it. That's really meticulous, and I guess you've developed that over the course of so much practice, and as you build more and more sets. And so once the image is taken, I was just wondering what then happens to the sets, and all the pieces, big and small, after the image has been taken. Including the fact that you're very rarely actually shown the sets themselves. So can you comment a little bit about this?
I really wish I had the liberty to keep all my sets up for longer periods of time, but they're quite large. So for example, the gym on the screen is over 42 feet. And I don't have the liberty to keep it on display, so to speak, or installed for a long period of time. I essentially design and create and assemble in a way that I can deconstruct and store everything. I have to say a large part of my studio is a storeroom because everything gets stacked up and then put away in an airtight space, simply because at the end of the day, I am using paper.
Right, we can imagine. I mean, the scale is mammoth, so that is a big question then about, how does it, doesn't, because you think about it coming together, but then you don't think about, at least for audiences, the afterlife then, because that's also a huge part of it.
Yeah, of course. And I always revisit parts of the set that I've made previously, just to see what I did and how I did it. Because once I'm on to the next set, the details are different. So I a lot of times revisit what I've done in the past.
Right. And, so then moving on to, your practice, besides being so multidisciplinary, also has continued to evolve, expand, and take on various roles and aspects. You're making an effort to take art out of the studio and actually into people's personal and community lives. For our audiences today, perhaps could you begin by telling us a little bit more about your more community-facing projects, such as the Corona Quilt project and the coloring scroll which you created for the Children's Hospital?
Sure, Uma, but I'd like to talk about the image on the screen first. So when I
yes, of course. Go ahead.
Sorry. So when I created the large sets, there was always a lot of paper dust on the floor in my studio, and my studio is filled with paper dust. That's when I began creating this other series of work, which is made purely out of paper dust. So I essentially started creating these idealistic landscapes that we are all kind of bombarded with on our screens through travel advertisements and through the beautiful photos that we see backlit on our screens, whether it's a television, an iPad, your computer, or even your phone. So I began recreating this ideal image of nature through paper dust. And this is at the India Art Fair in Delhi, where I've displayed two works simultaneously, where one is a print in the traditional form, and the second one is a little light box, which functions the same way as our technology functions. So you can charge it for 2 hours and it runs for 8 hours. And then it's also a backlit image. I'm not sure how much you can tell from the screen. So you can switch it on and off the same way we do with our computer or iPad or with our cell phone. And then it dies after 8 hours and then you can recharge it. So I'm almost questioning whether we look at images, how we respond to images differently today, simply because we're so conditioned to see them with backlighting.
Yeah, it transforms it almost, no? And then to hear what it's actually made up of.
They're all very familiar landscapes yet again that we've all seen somewhere, but you won't necessarily know where or when. So they're very stark landscapes that, which is almost like escape tourism, which I don't know if it really exists, but yeah, that's where the idea comes from.
And also, can you comment perhaps, Dia, a little bit on, the scale? Because, we've been talking now about these massive sets that you're creating. And now you just in terms of scale, because then this is, wholly different, because it's so much more micro than those sets, but, they're, almost luminous. And how does that speak differently to you?
So made out of paper tubes are exactly to scale. They're 1:1. Whereas these sets in construction are about 7 to 8 feet. So it's like piles and piles of paper dust that form what I'm trying to create. But the image itself is much smaller. It's about 2.8 inches by 5.5 inches. So it's tiny. It's literally the size of your cell phone. And yeah, I think that working with two extreme scales to me is really, really interesting, because I get to look at and explore various extensions of my own practice. Because of course, when I light this or when I construct it, I have to deal with it very differently. The paper dust is tiny, Just to give you an idea, it essentially feels like sand, but it's weightless, so it's not as heavy as sand.
Oh, that's interesting to note. And just as a medium and the scales, I think it's so versatile as a as an artist to have these various practices. And then Dia, so can you tell us a little bit about your community projects, just to round it up?
So there was one project that I did in March 2020 called the Corona Quilt project. I did it with one of my closest childhood friends, Neha Modi, and we were just talking on the phone through the lockdown, like we all connected to our loved ones. And we were like, we have to do something because this is such a strange time we're living in. And this was back in June 2020, where we didn't really know where we were going, where the world was going, or we couldn't really comprehend what was going on around us because we were all locked in at that point. So at that point, we decided that we would reach out to our immediate communities and contact our friends and our families and ask them to do a 15 by 15 inch expression of their COVID experience on a fabric square. We received over 18,000 submissions over a period of 7 months. And this was one of the installations in Bombay. This is called Warriors Rise. It was installed at the Haji Ali pumping station, which essentially pumps the water through the city. So for this location, we designed a heart, like a pumping heart, quite literally. So the heart in the center is squares submitted by various individuals like you and me at the community at large, whereas the black and white areas are images that I photographed of COVID warriors who were on the forefront and working on ground, keeping us safe while we were all back home, as a tribute and a thank you to the community in Bombay who really kept everything together. This is just a close-up of the individual images. So we photographed doctors, nurses, policemen, people from the wet waste management who were still cleaning our streets. We photographed all the people in the public space who were really keeping the city alive and pumping us through this time.
I mean, it's heartening to see, just how this came together. And I think, just your response. I mean, the ways of, responding to times like these. We've seen so many artists, really coming together with the community and to do something like this just must have been, on a different scale, I guess. And Dia, can you also tell us about the Children's Hospital and that scroll as well?
Sure. So as I collect magazines in my studio and have a lot of those, I also have a lot of newspapers in my studio because I collect those as well. Right. A while ago, I decided to make pencils out of them, which are essentially like my paper tubes, except they're made out of paper and it's acid-free lead. And I also designed a coloring rule, which is 15 feet long. That's been designed with all the drawings I use, which is the foundation of the set I'm eventually building. So it has elements from all the constructed images that I've done in the form of drawing. The director at SRCC Children's Hospital in Mumbai, she contacted me. She said, we're going through a really tough time right now because with COVID, all the CSR and all the funds are going towards COVID relief, whereas the rest of the society and the children were not really being addressed with their day-to-day needs, whether they had to have a heart transplant or a kidney transplant. And she said, what can we do? I said, let me think about it and get back to you. I think it would be interesting to do something that we could engage with. So I essentially created this coloring rule made out of recycled paper and non-toxic ink. And these color pencils where the proceeds from this sale go to helping the children at the hospital. And that's really where this idea came about. I kind of feel like it came full circle because I was actually using things from my studio, material that I'm very familiar with. And it's almost like an extension of my practice, but in a completely different form. I also printed everything by screen printing, so it was a hand-done process. And it was very aligned with the way I work in my studio, and it was really exciting. But I have to say, the most satisfying was when I took this to the hospital and saw all the children working with it. It was really gratifying to see that, because I think with something like coloring, it really allows you to say what you don't want to say in words. And yeah, that's really where this idea came about.
Yeah, it's just really interesting to see this aspect as well of your practice. And I think it also comments a little bit about, through acts like this, whether it's the Corona Quilt project or, the scroll, we're also thinking, it makes your work so much more accessible, right? It's taken off, and into the, hearts and homes and everyday lives of people. And I think that's a really great quality to have. And, just to have your art then be so accessible and really engage with the community,
I haven't really thought about it that way, to be honest with you. But it's kind of just parts of my practice. If you look closely, there's a chair which is in one of my waiting rooms. Or if you look at the bottom, there's a square area, which is the design of my tiles that go onto the floor. I've got a dumbbell from the gym. I've got a ketchup bottle from my supermarket. So I've got elements of all my work coming together. And the idea was that I wanted to create something in a tube form and not necessarily in a book, because that's how I work as in my studio. So essentially, this role is a repeat pattern. So it's repeated 12 times. And I think it was the part of the repetition of what I do that has come out in this practice unknowingly.
That's a lovely correlation to think about, from what you're talking about, your paper tubes and your big installations to the scroll.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe now you could tell us a little bit about, these stories and perceptions that, your work and practice weaves together. One of the undercurrents connecting all the varying facets also is this subtle commentary, on sustainability, mindfulness of resources, and engaging with the community. Does this run through all other aspects of your life? And do you find it becoming more and more perhaps of a concern that engages you?
I have to say that my work is almost a reflection of my life, and a life is a reflection of my work, and it almost coexists. I don't think as an artist, my practice is contained to a studio, because I'm really responding to what is going on around me. And yeah, I have to say they both coexist. So all the aspects of the practice that are obvious are a part of my day-to-day life, and a lot of my day-to-day life, and I would say my personality, is reflected in my practice as well.
Right. And, can you then tell us what do you think, is the role of an artist today in shaping and imagining a new future?
I don't think I can tell you about the role of an artist today, but I could maybe answer for myself.
Yeah.
Personally, I feel we spend so much of our time in a landscape that we're so familiar with. Yet I really wonder how much we are navigated towards, and what is really influencing our cognitive and behavioral development, and even our emotional, mental, and physical health. So I really feel my practice for me really allows me to get deeper into what I'm surrounded by and what is around me.
Thank you. I mean, thank you for sharing that. I know it's really personal, but it's lovely to just hear, even if just a small insight. And just to sum up today, can you tell us a little bit about perhaps what you're working on next? Give us a sneak peek or something like that.
Yeah, I'm working on a few things, but most importantly, I'm working on getting my work ready for the India Art Fair in February.
Yes. We're very excited to see what you've been working on, dear. There.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dia. I think this has been really enlightening, to learn much more about your practice and just your what has inspired you and your impressions of things and how you've your process. Thanks so much for sharing with us today. I would say that I think we have a few questions there. Perhaps if you'd like to look at your question box
Sure.
and maybe you could choose a few that you'd like to answer for us today.
Why don't you choose them for me?
Okay, all right. Let's see. We have quite a few questions today. So we have, thank you so much, Dia, for this lovely talk. I was wondering about your thoughts about the nature of photography and the image today. So with all of us living in an image-saturated world and making and consuming so many images through social media, etc.
I think at the end of the day, we use technology to create an image. And we are really talking about technology when we look at social media or everything around us. And I think it's the way we look at images is changing along with the way technology is evolving. So I think it's really a little bit more personal as to how you would respond to it and where you're at and how much time you're spending on the technology.
Yeah, I think that.
I mean, today we all have the liberty of making beautiful images because technology has evolved so much with cell phones, and everybody today is a photographer. And I'm sure all of us make at least one image a day when we need to say something to someone or show something to someone or document something. I mean, I would say we're all photographers in that sense.
We have another question here that says, thank you for this in-depth look into such amazing work. Would Dia say that these captivating images of public spaces have taken on a new dimension in the time of COVID? That's a great question. What would you like to say, Dia, to that?
I have to say that prior to COVID, I used to spend a lot of time and I did a really small project and I would go into like stadiums or I would go into a movie theater when it wasn't being occupied and just spend time in it. And sometimes when I look at the constructed images, it's interesting to see them without people because that's really how they have been for so many months today. Yeah, I haven't thought about it in depth, but it's a bit uncanny.
Yeah. That's a good question. Huh? It's almost, it's definitely puts it in a different context when we're looking at a, COVID lens, really.
Absolutely. Well, it wasn't, they weren't created or constructed keeping COVID in mind. Of course, I had no idea about it.
Yeah. No. It's just how these, you think differently suddenly. Your approach to places, becomes so different.
I also feel since things have opened up in the last few weeks and we begin revisiting these places we used to visit so often and so frequently, there's almost a sense of wonder and familiarity with them. It's not like we have forgotten how to interact with them since we've been absent for them for over a year now.
Yeah.
I visited a couple of spaces and it was a really, I don't know, it was nice because there was a sense of familiarity that, oh wow, I've come to the movies after such a long time. It's so nice.
Yeah.
And there is that sense of familiarity for sure.
Thank you. We have a comment from Iram Sultan who says, Dia, I love your work, everything about it, from technique to scale to that delicate dichotomy and tension in your work between the public and private worlds that we inhabit. Your paper dust works are also an ode to sustainability. Can you please tell us about your library work?
Thank you, Iram. Thank you so much. I'm an avid reader, and it's actually a bookstore work that we saw. I mean, I don't think it's on the presentation, but the work that I have made before. I spent a lot of time in my childhood, in my teenage years, at bookstores, and just browsing through book spines and books that attracted me on display and reading a little bit, and then going back and borrowing books from libraries. I think I spent my childhood reading a lot. And I feel today that if we're not really engaging with the books we read necessarily in the physical form, because I'm assuming most people are reading on the Kindle or on the iPad. I read on the Kindle today because it's much easier. And also, I feel the last few times I've gone to a bookstore, there aren't that many options available. It's really just the bestsellers and the ones that have done commercially well. But a bookstore was a really interesting space to me and still is, simply because you can get lost in that space and you can spend hours and hours at a bookstore. And it's really the graphics and the titles and the familiarity that leads you to choose whichever book you pick up, because I don't think there could be necessarily a conscious reason for like browsing through a bookstore. It's almost like the subconscious. And I do believe, for me, it's a very strong private moment in a public space, because I'm sure we've all spent time reading books cover to cover in the bookstores at some point in our life. And you've created your own world, even though you're in a space that is much larger and way beyond you. It's not a space that is in the confines of your own home or you're still in a public space, but you've created your own experiences there depending on the books you're reading.
Thank you, Dia. And just one last question, I think that's quite interesting. So it says, such a breathtaking practice. Dia, would you ever consider using the sets you make to construct moving images or films?
I would love to. I have to say, I used a lot of Dreamweaver when I was in college, but it was a long time ago. I would love to do it one day when the time is right.
Thank you, Dia. I think we have a few more questions, but I think we're out of time. So we'll wrap up for today. I just want to say a huge thank you from all of us at India Art Fair, from all our audiences and BMW, for just letting us in, and having this opportunity to learn about you and your practice, and for sharing your time and your insight and an insight into your life as an artist. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Uma, for the opportunity, and to the entire team at the India Art Fair. They've been amazing to work with. And thank you, everybody, for taking your time and logging on and learning a little bit more of what I do. Thank you.
Thank you, Dia. And everybody, I'd just like to say, we actually have a BMW artist film that features Dia that's out now and can be viewed on our website. So please do check it out. Thank you to all our audiences for joining today. We hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I hope to see you again, especially at India Art Fair in February 2022. Thank you all.
Thank you, Uma. Thank you again.